Climate change. It has to be one of the most polarising issues of our time. At least in part that's probably because the vast majority of us aren't climate scientists and don't read the scientific research. Instead, we rely on journalists, bloggers or talking heads on TV who for the most part are equally uninformed. And yes, I know there are gradations of quality. There are some out there that do read the scientific literature and have a better understanding. However, most of us still rely on journalists and others to interpret the climate scientists' work, and so I understand when non-experts get things wrong, especially in a complicated field like climate science. But there are some journalists that are downright dishonest and deliberately misrepresent the data, which then gets cut and pasted by others that are too lazy to check the sources. And so to this article from James Delingpole. Climate alarmists finally admit we were wrong about global warming. Climate alarmists have finally admitted they've got it wrong on global warming. This is the inescapable conclusion of a landmark paper published in Nature Geoscience, which finally admits that the computer models have overstated the impact of carbon dioxide on climate and that the planet is warming more slowly than predicted. The paper, titled Emission Budgets and Pathways Consistent with Limiting Warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, concedes that it is now almost impossible that the doomsday predictions made in the last IPCC assessment report of 1.5 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels by 2022 will come true. Well then, I guess we should all go out and take a sledgehammer to our solar panels, except that, as the authors pointed out in a subsequent article written in response to media misrepresentation, the 2013 IPCC report made no such prediction. In fact, the IPCC specifically assessed that temperatures in the 2020s would be 0.9 to 1.3 degrees warmer than pre-industrial, the lower end of which is already looking conservative. Anyone who had troubled to read our paper would have found this IPCC AR5 Chapter 11 projection helpfully labelled on two of our figures and clearly consistent with our new results. And here is that chart, and as you can see, the range of 0.9 to 1.3 degrees projection by the IPCC. So you have to ask the question, did Delingpole even read the paper? I have to hit up my university contacts every time I want an article without paying for it, but I'm sure journalists have access to this stuff via the organisations they work for. So what does this article that caused Delingpole and others to jump to erroneous conclusions really say? Well, as mentioned previously, it appeared in Nature Geoscience a couple of weeks ago and looks at the cumulative carbon budget. So what is the cumulative carbon budget, I hear you ask? Well, basically it's how much carbon needs to accumulate in the atmosphere before average global temperature rises by 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels. And what's so special about 1.5 degrees? Well, that's the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement, to keep global temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So the paper found that the accumulated carbon needed to reach the 1.5 degree level is higher than had been previously estimated. So that means that the current level of carbon accumulation will reach that level in approximately 20 years instead of the previous estimate of about 7 years, essentially giving us more time. Quote, our estimates suggest that we would have a remaining carbon budget equivalent to around 20 years at current emission rates for a 2 in 3 chance of restricting end-of-century warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, there seems to be some confusion about what has changed. Many articles ran with the line that the models had overestimated warming. But that confusion seems to come from a misinterpretation of possibly this chart and or, as Zeke Housefather on Carbon Brief pointed out, this particular line in the article. After 2020, by which time the CMIP5 ensemble mean human-induced warming is over 0.3 degrees warmer than the central estimate for human-induced warming to 2015. And in a follow-up blog post, the authors of the original article show a close-up of that chart to illustrate this difference, represented by the red arrow. The black cross represents the observed estimate of human-induced warming, about 0.9 to 1 degree relative to the pre-industrial era, whereas the average of the Earth system models, blue dotted line, predicted about 1.2 to 1.3 degrees of warming. So from that comparison, it appears that the models overestimated by about 0.3 degrees. However, remember that the actual observed estimate for human-induced warming is a 2015 number, and the model estimates are 2020 numbers. As Housefather notes, This exercise, aimed at assessing the remaining carbon budget for aggressive climate targets such as 1.5 degrees Celsius, was not intended to be a detailed comparison of the performance of climate models and observations to date, and cannot be used to determine if the models are accurately estimating the climate response to increased atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. He goes on to note that if you make a comparison between the 2015 observed data and the model data for 2015 instead of 2020, the difference reduces to about 0.17 degrees Celsius. Also, this is only one data set. Other data sets yield differences between 0.11 degrees and 0.01 degrees. So the discrepancy is between the observed accumulated 545 gigatons of carbon at the end of 2014, whereas in many of the ESM models, the total accumulated CO2 emissions do not reach that level until well after 2020, by which time the level of human-induced warming in the models can indeed be about 0.3% warmer, as is consistent with the aforementioned IPC forecast of 0.9 to 1.3 degrees, which the authors used in their paper. So given the 545 gigatons of carbon that had been emitted to the end of 2014, the previous carbon budget of 615 gigatons of carbon is too low. Instead of an additional 70 gigatons of carbon, the authors estimate the 1.5 degree level would not be reached until cumulative emissions are more than 200 gigatons of carbon above the current level, and hence the extra breathing room. Now, the authors are in no way implying that we can now sit back and relax. They clearly state that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is not yet a geophysical impossibility, but it is likely to require delivery on strengthened pledges for 2030, followed by challengingly deep and rapid mitigation. Another way to think about it is that to achieve the 1.5 degree level by the end of the century would require a straight line decrease in carbon dioxide emissions from today's values to zero in about 40 years. Now, you can disagree with the science behind man-made global warming, the Paris Climate Agreement, or the predictions of scientists, but if you're going to do so by claiming the climate models in this paper are significantly overestimating man-made global warming, then you A, don't understand the research, which is not a crime, B, haven't done your own research and are just regurgitating talking points, or C, like Delingpole, you're being deliberately dishonest. And if you don't have access to the paper, you might want to read the non-technical blog post by the authors and their article critical of the media that are all linked below. I'll see you next time.